This is part 4 of the events review, week 12.4 to 12.8. I'm going to talk about 4 events, starting with Matthias Passlack. He's a semiconductor specialist, and he's talking about new materials for semiconductors, in particular ferroelectric materials. Now, I've spoken about this before. There was a lady, a PhD, that I spoke about under Philip Wong. I forgot her name. I'll put it in the show notes. Now, the idea here is that you can help solve the memory wall with faster semiconductor chips, in particular for memory. Next is a presentation about fluid dynamics. I'm not going to put the names here just with respect in time. It's Tina Katopodes Chow, fluid dynamics. What was interesting here is the way she thinks about the problem. It's modeling how wind flows through a wind farm. This was a little bit interesting in terms of what actually is being done, in terms of, okay, how do you set up wind farms, and what's the problem, and what's the sort of considerations of wind farms and things along those lines. But I think more interesting actually is just the science itself. Okay, what do they actually do? They model forces, fluids, how they move through space, and they have to consider topographies and things along those lines. So to me, that was the more interesting part about this presentation, and part of this sabbatical, right, is to really get a sense for what science is doing, what people are doing in other areas, and things along those lines. Douglas Gulbeault, I might be butchering his name, Douglas Gulbeault. Now, this was pretty interesting. He himself is a PhD in theoretical linguistics, or something like that, maybe cognitive linguistics, actually, cognitive linguistics. And what's really fascinating about this talk is just the question itself. Okay, how do we build categories? How do we build things like, what's pop culture? What is a good movie? What is why do we call something rock music, and then pop music, and then how do these categories evolve? And of course, that whole question has a whole other relevance now with what's going on social media and all the categorization, and actually it transcends into categorizing, large language models, categorizing what's good or bad, what's fair. Does this particular answer belong? Is this a sexy answer? Is it an offensive answer? So all these kinds of questions come up, and I think David's contribution here is to offer a point of view from linguistics, and Douglas's view. And I can't just emphasize enough how important it is to think across disciplines, to think across domains, because that's really where the rubber meets the road sometimes. It's the domain knowledge, it's the specific understanding of a field, and then it's the cross-pollination that often gets actually results, or the interesting thing. I mean, this is almost like exploration with exploitation. So lastly, I'm going to talk about Sylvain Catherine. He's a finance professor at Wharton. He's talking about how how households react or behave relative to interest rates. Now, that to me is it's finance economics 101, basic stuff. You can argue about the validity of these things. To me, it was interesting. Look, I'm an MBA. I'm a trained economist, but I'm a trained economist with an MBA, and I've spent a lot of my time, a lot of my career in macroeconomics, and in particular in financial economics, relative value. I've done sort of the big stuff, playing in currencies and commodities. We are now, the Orange Capital Project, doing very different things. My sabbatical at Stanford is all about technology and technological innovation and AI, but I have this love affair still with this field. That's why I go to these. That's why I go to these seminars. And I thought Sylvain's talk was interesting because it opened up certain questions to me. One, Sylvain said that the income inequality goes up with lower interest rates, and I just thought to myself, how about human capital? When rates are low, human capital is at risk because technological disruption is at risk, and that, on average, turns human capital less valuable. That would be my takeaway from this call. And again, really nice example of how you can cross-pollinate through different through disciplines and really learn a lot by doing that. This is not even on podcast. It's December 12th, 2023. This is Crim Telco. This is the second installment of today. The markets have changed a little bit. We are down 2% for the day. The market's up 0.5% for the year. We're up 106.7%. The market's up 20.5%. We're outperforming by 86.2%. So let me start with actually Sylvain's presentation. The first one. Actually, excuse me. No. Let's go with the prelude ranking. So we start with Matthias Passlack, right? So this is in the electrical engineering department, and it's a presentation about the possibility of using new materials in semiconductor design, in particular for memory, for non-volatile memory. So I think I'm fascinated by this topic ever since I've discovered Onur Mutlu and his thoughts, and he's not the only one talking about the memory wall. Obviously, lots of people around the computer engineering world are talking about this. The memory wall is the problem that we have to move data around, in particular in machine learning workloads, because we're continuously updating weights, and continuously updating weights is a problem. It's a problem in several domains. One of them is that we have to store transient information, which is, in a sense, it's not a waste, of course, but can we find more efficient ways to store transient information? Because we really don't care about the weight in the first, coming up with weights is kind of like a process where you don't care about all the intermediate steps, you only care about the end. So it's the inverse of the death of 1,000 knife cuts, right? It's the inverse of that. It's life with 1,000 steps. And I'm wondering if, the industry is wondering, how can we solve that now? Ferroelectric materials, which is what Matthias Passlack was demonstrating, could be one path towards that because they offer much faster switching. They have intermediate domains, which means that you can update them. You can have updates in the physics, right? This is not just 0 and 1. You can have the way they behave is you can update them. You can change their properties gradually, and therefore use that property maybe to store those intermediate results, and then have less moving of data from the logic into the memory. This is the key, right? Less moving from logic into memory. You have faster switching. You have lower currents, lower power consumption. So a lot of good things that could happen. Matthias himself, just to maybe say a few words about that, I thought he was interesting to see also what kind of people work in this field. He's with TSMC. He has been working in the field for a long time. And also the professor, the Stanford professor, introduced him, was interesting. I forgot his name. But in general, I think these types of events are interesting because they offer a glimpse into a field that I think is adjacent, but it's becoming more and more crucial, because I think the bigger the models, the more data, the more we're going to have to find better solutions for hardware. Next, I want to talk about the fluid mechanics presentation. I thought what was interesting about the fluid mechanics presentation was, like I said in the prelude, first and foremost, what is actually going on? Okay, well, why is this even a problem? Well, if you set up a wind farm, you have to think about, okay, how's the wind going to blow through this? How are the windmills going to react to the wind? And the lady that presented was fascinating. Like they showed, let's say, how they have this one windmill in Portugal. They sensor it up in many different ways, and and measure all kinds of things. And the idea is the following: the idea is to build a model of the actual geography and the actual meteorology and topology of a place, humidity and all kinds of things, and then try to model how the wind will how the weather will be, the sort of macro weather, and then the micro weather, and then the actual local effects of flow and all kinds of forces. If you think about fluid dynamics, what fluid dynamics really is you can dissect the fluid into a lot of small vectors and then see how they behave. So in that sense, it's kind of almost like it's very similar to gradient descent in a sense, because that's what gradient descent is. In a sense, it's a fluid model too, but you have these little vectors. Each node is a little vector, and those vectors change with the data coming in. So the data is the flow, and the vectors are and the model is sort of the resistance to the flow, or if you want the analogy, you have the windmill, which acts and changes the direction of the vectors, and those vectors then end up creating something, energy. So in that sense, it's kind of very related, and I think this is you could say that fluid dynamics and machine learning have a very similar. Well, they're kind of the same thing, just looked at from two different angles. And but maybe more importantly, just from a scientific point of view, what fluid dynamics really is or in general what science does is you want to look at how nature affects something. In this case, let's say windmills. You want to build a model. Then you want to test it. And then you want to refine it, and then the North Star would be to pinpoint a map, say, I want to build a wind farm here, and you get a result saying, okay, if you build a wind farm here, this is what you can expect. Next is Douglas Gulbeault. He's a researcher in cognitive linguistics, and his work is on understanding how categories are built, and categories in social groups. So we're talking now about human social type of stuff. This has, at least for now, nothing to do with machine learning or anything like that. So when we take a social group, we can ask the following question. If we ask people to categorize, let's say, whether a joke is funny, or whether a certain statement is offensive, or whether a certain piece of music is a good piece of music, whether it's rock music or pop music, or whether we should find a new category. If we ask them to actually build new categories, any kind of problem along those lines, there is a fundamental question to be asked, which is, on the one hand, we have individuals which are very diverse, and we would therefore expect lots of diverse categories, right? We would expect diverse, let's say, formulations of this is a funny joke, or what is a funny joke, or what is this piece of music is, I will call it, this is Motown or not Motown, or any kind of category would, from a first principle approach, you would think that humans are different, humans have different experiences, humans are unique, so therefore categorization should be unique. Now, what Douglas did, and also very interestingly, he did it across cultures. So you would not just expect within a culture lots of difference, but also in intraculture, right? And what Douglas found is that when the groups are small, there is a lot of diversity in categorization, and the larger groups become, the more convergence we have. So you have a larger group of people, and at some point there's an inflection point where diversity gets lost, and we go towards, I guess, the law of large numbers probably. Somehow a large number of participants tends to move the equilibrium into some binary solution. So let's say if you have 10 people and they might categorize a piece of music, you might get like 8 different categorizations. If you have 100,000 people, you just might get, let's say, rock or pop, something along those lines. And I think this is really interesting research because it also highlights the importance of um, categorizing large language models. So if we take this a little bit further now, if we think about this in terms of how a machine will interpret prompts and generate pieces of art or pieces of response or any kind of things like that, you kind of have to classify it somehow. You have to teach the models whether a certain response is good, whether a certain response is sexy, whether it's fair, whether it's rocky or poppy, or whatever new category you come up with. And I think this research that Douglas is conducting, to me, fits really nicely into the question of reinforcement learning with human feedback. It fits nicely with what Kilchner and his people are doing with Open Assistant. It fits nicely with Eureka, which is sort of the reinforcement learning reward, automatic reward machine that they created to help robots. So it's interesting work. I think it's subtle. We need to be careful about these things, how we classify things, and I think we need to keep the separation between human and machine in mind. Okay, we need to keep that in mind. So I think, to me, this part of research is not just it's inspiring, but it's also very important. Talk about Tina Katopodes Chow. She gave a presentation about fluid dynamics, and let me talk about the presentation and the actual engineering discipline of fluid dynamics, and then I want to sort of draw the line a little bit further out and make some speculative comments about how I see fluid dynamics and machine learning actually converge. So what Tina was talking about was her work in modeling how wind farms behave, how weather can be modeled, how local weather and micro weather can be modeled when it comes to wind farms. The question is, I guess, pretty straightforward. Think about, like, you have a piece of land and you're thinking, you have the question, should I even put a wind farm here? And if so, how should I set up the windmills so I get the maximum bang for the buck? So this is a modeling problem. You have a fluid, a gas, a wind, air, whatever you want to call it, and it comes your way, and now you have to figure out how to set up those wind farms so they collect the most amount of energy, and that, you know, if you take the wind modeling problem, sort of, if you abstract a little bit, what is it exactly? The wind modeling problem is it's you can represent air as a bunch of vectors, like many small vectors that come in a certain direction. There's a force, there's a direction, and then it gets diverted by, let's say, a windmill, right? And that creates other forces, that creates drag and yaw and other words that the engineering community uses. For example, the energy that is being transmitted from the wind into the windmill. There's some drag, and there's some wear and tear that is to be expected. So a lot of that modeling happens, and what Tina and her group is trying to come at is, think about it like if you had a map and you just say, I want to put a wind farm here. How about you get an answer to questions like, how much energy can I get out of it? What kind of wind conditions do I have throughout the year? When should I expect more energy versus less energy? All kinds of questions that, of course, could be incredibly interesting for wind farm operators. Now, in general, what you learn from a presentation like that is, of course, also how science actually works. Okay, what Tina does, they actually literally have a wind farm in Portugal. Actually, it's one windmill which is being sensored up, and they measure how topography, soil, humidity, air, wind flow, weather, morning, night, afternoon, dusk and dawn, and all of these things, how they affect the wind farm. if you have this type of information, you can model wind farms. Then you can use that. You can, for example, predict when there will be more energy versus less energy. You can tie that to the grid. You can expect, let's say, if you have something like Bitcoin mining attached to it, you can expect when to mine Bitcoin and when not to mine. So there's a lot of these types of things you can do. And what people like Tina are doing is they're trying to fit a model to observations, the way nature acts with physical systems, and try to fit as well as they can, which is what a lot of science really is all about. Now, I think I want to just sort of add a speculative comment here, which is that when I look at fluid mechanics, it kind of reminds me of machine learning. Okay, the flow is the data, the algorithm is the object that is in the way of the flow, and then the flow moves around that object in certain ways, and then what we get at the other end, that would be the model, or what we call the model in machine learning, or in fluid mechanics, it's the energy that is being transmitted, that is being created. So I see parallels here, because when you look at the vector space that fluid mechanics represents, it looks very similar to, let's say, what Stefano Armon is talking about when he talks about direct preference optimization. It's a very similar approach, right? You have a certain flow. In fluid mechanics, it would be the fluid, which is represented by small localized vectors, which then flow in a certain way. There's a direction, there's a force, and then those vectors get diverted, and that creates certain energy fields and things along those lines. In machine learning, the flow is data, and that data can be represented in terms of vectors, and those vectors get diverted by the model, and then the result is a certain result. I mean, the result is the weights in the model, which represent how those vectors got diverted, and that is the information that we need. That is the function approximation that happens, let's say, in direct preference optimization. Lastly, I want to mention Sylvain Catherine. He's a finance professor at Wharton, and he spoke about a paper that he presented how households behave relative to interest rates. Now, one of his theses is that households get affected by interest rates in a disproportionate way. Rich people get the discrepancy between rich and poor increases with lower interest rates. Now, that was one of the calls he makes in this paper. He looks at the paper from a sort of dynamic hedging perspective. So he's using a Black-Scholes type model to model the behavior of households when it comes to interest rates. I think whenever we have these types of dynamic models in finance, some sort of dynamic hedging comes into play. The same here. And then he concludes that it makes a couple of conclusions which are interesting. One is that the interest rate sensitivity to a household is hump-shaped. That means it's an inverted U with age. So you have a certain increase of interest rate sensitivity and then a decrease that has to do with age, and also the spending. Makes sense that maybe in your 40s and 50s you have the highest interest rate sensitivity, and then it starts declining because you start spending money. So things along those lines. I think what's interesting in this conversation to me is not just the way households behave according to the assumptions of Sylvain, which is that you have assets that you can hedge your exposure with. I personally would like to see more work on human capital, because that is usually the most important asset that people have. And human capital is actually highly positively related to interest rates. So when interest rates go down, the value of human capital goes down. When interest rates go up, the value of human capital goes up. And the reason is because with lower interest rates, the risk of technologically driven disruption goes up, which is bad for human capital. Now, that is quite a stretch, and I would say a lot of people might disagree with me. I personally believe that the problem with technological disruption is that it adds to the wealth of the nation, but it actually decreases the median human capital. So, in other words, a few people make a lot of money, but most people actually get hurt by technological innovation. So I asked him that question. He did not agree to engage in that conversation because, in his perspective, you have human capital and another asset that you can use to hedge, and that other asset can be used to offset the interest rate sensitivity, and therefore you're not as much exposed to interest rates as if you just had a human capital. In my view, actually, that's an interesting question to ask. How is human capital related to interest rates? And then also the conclusion from there would be, how do households behave with interest rates? So again, Sylvain's presentation is, to me, it's less important actually what he comes up with. What I'm interested in a lot more is the methodology, and that's something that I think can lead to more interesting ideas and more interesting research. So to summarize, I spoke about Matthias Passlack and his research on ferroelectric materials to solve some of the memory problems, particularly memory wall. I spoke about Douglas, the last name eludes me now, that he spoke about he's a cognitive linguist, so he talks about how we categorize things, how humans and how societies categorize things. Tina, she spoke about fluid mechanics and how fluid mechanics can be used to model wind behavior and those sort of things. And lastly, Sylvain Catherine, who showed a model, who presented a model where he analyzes the behavior of households with respect to interest rates. Thank you.